So today, first day of Unit 6, which is Chapter 7 in your textbook. We're going to start with something that you've done in the past called Trigonometric Identities. So you did do these last year. They can be kind of complicated, but the more you practice them, the easier they'll get. So the main thing that we're going to do today is I'm going to remind you of a few basic rules, and then you're going to do some practice on Class Kick, and then after that you can work on your homework, which is a Math Excel. Let me quickly go to the calendar for this unit. So here it is. This is a new calendar. You can see that today is Trig Identities, and then tomorrow and Wednesday and Thursday we start on some other formulas, and then move through until next week on Wednesday when you're going to have a quiz that'll go through all of these new formulas but will not include what you do on Friday. Okay? All right, so here we go. So first of all, you should know these identities because we use them all the time. So when we say quotient identities, there's a couple of different ways you can think of it. See how well my stylus works today. So a quotient identity, as in tangent, would be something like you could say, well, you can see this one isn't going to work very well. Let's try the stylus. So sine over cosine, just like cotangent is cosine over sine. But you could also think of cotangent as 1 over tangent as well. So don't forget about that option. You can see I don't have the best styluses here at home. Mine are actually at school. Okay, and then the reciprocal identities then, as you already know, are using the reciprocal functions. So cosecant is the reciprocal of sine. Secant is the reciprocal of cosine. And cotangent, like I said, is the reciprocal of tangent. But that could also fall under the quotient identities as well. Okay, so the other identity, or actually other three identities that you need to remember, come from what are called the Pythagorean identities. So the first identity that you have to memorize, which you have to memorize all of these, by the way, is knowing sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. That's actually the Pythagorean theorem, but in terms of trig. So real quick, let me show you a quick sketch of that. Let me actually get a new quick little page for that. So if you have your right triangle, and here's your theta, okay, and let's say that this right triangle is on the unit circle, so your hypotenuse is 1. We know that this side is x, this side is y. Okay, so here's my right triangle on the unit circle. And using Pythagorean theorem, you could easily say x squared plus y squared. Fix that. X squared plus y squared equals 1. Well, you also know from trig that x is considered cosine, so you actually have cosine squared, and y is considered sine squared. Okay, so you can just replace those x's and y's with their trigonometric equals. Okay, so that's where the name Pythagorean identity comes from. So this is the first one that comes just from your normal unit circle. You can get the other two by dividing by either sine squared or cosine squared. So what we mean by that is if I take sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1 and divide each portion of it by, let's say, cosine squared. So each term gets divided by cosine squared. And you get sine over cosine is tangent. So I have tangent squared. Cosine squared over cosine squared is 1. And 1 over cosine squared is equal to secant squared. So this is a second identity, a second Pythagorean identity. And then the third one could be derived by dividing each term by sine squared. So sine squared over sine squared is 1. cosine squared over sine squared is cotangent squared, and 1 over sine squared is cosecant squared. So these three are the three Pythagorean identities. And I'll be honest with you, I don't really have these two memorized exactly in my head. I always do this division just to make sure I'm remembering it correctly. So I rarely just know it. I have to divide myself. So there's nothing wrong with doing this procedure every single time. Okay, so when you go to do the activity that you're going to do, there are some rules that you'll want to remember as you're trying to look for them. So first of all, the best thing you can do for yourself, especially when you're first starting out, is to rewrite things in terms of sine of theta, cosine of theta, or sine of x, cosine x. You then also want to look for the reciprocal identities that might be helpful. See if you can re-express something in one of the Pythagorean identities. And then a general rule is that it's easier to start working with the more complicated side. So when you do these, you're only ever going to change one side of the equation. So if you start with the more complicated side and try to make it easier, it usually goes better. And then you do want to be able to recognize factors or factoring rules, right? So this is a difference of squares, the first one. This is a perfect square. And then this is the sum and difference of cubes. So knowing these three and how to factor them will be beneficial. If you don't remember those rules, this might be an opportunity for you to use your computer and look them up and write them down. Okay, so on your handout, it says you're going to do the reordering activity first. But since I'm not there, we're going to do these two under the extra practice first, and then you're going to do the reordering activity. So these are the first two that I'm going to do for you. So when I look at this first one, clearly the left side is more complicated than the right side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute that sign, but before I do that, I think I'm going to rewrite cotangent and tangent in terms of sine and cosine. So I'm going to rewrite cotangent as cosine over sine, and tangent as sine over cosine. And again, you only manipulate one side of the equation. So the right side is going to stay secant theta. Now I'm going to distribute. Oops, dropped my pen. So when I distribute sine, I just get cosine of theta plus sine squared theta over cosine theta. Okay, well, clearly that's not equal to secant, so I'm going to have to do more on the left-hand side. So now I'm going to get a common denominator. This is another common or helpful thing to kind of have in your back pocket, is to think about changing everything into a common denominator. So my common denominator here will be cosine, which means my numerator of the first fraction will become cosine squared. And then I am going to write it as one fraction. So my one fraction is cosine squared plus sine squared over cosine. And there's our Pythagorean identity that cosine squared plus sine squared is equal to 1. So I have 1 over cosine, and 1 over cosine is equal to secant. Most of the time, especially when you do this reordering activity or you're following somebody else's procedure, it will go all the way down to the left is exactly equal to the right. So I get secant equals secant. Okay, next one. I am going to look at this thing and probably, like most people, go, gosh, there's a lot going on there. Where should I start? So clearly I'm not going to try and change the right-hand side because that's obviously very simplified. My first reaction is that I want to factor something out, but there's nothing that factors out. But maybe there will be when I change everything into the into sines and cosines, or maybe things will cancel. So let's see. So tangent squared becomes sine squared over cosine squared times cosine squared. Yep, stuff is going to cancel. And cotangent becomes cosine squared over sine squared times sine squared. And then I can cancel those things like that, and I am left with sine squared plus cosine squared, which that is an identity. 1 equals 1. This is where I'm saying a lot of times they will take it all the way down to the left exactly equals the right, but I would be okay if you left it here because that's an actual identity that we know. Okay, notice that one looked more complicated, but it actually took less time. All right, so what you're going to do now is go back to Google Classroom, and linked on Google Classroom is a class kick activity, which it's probably been a while since you've done a class kick activity. What you do with this is you click on the link, use your student view name to log on. It will give you directions on how to solve to go about reordering. So you're basically going to be doing like a drag and drop activity where you're going to try and put the correct steps that are given to you in the correct order. I want you to complete at least 4 of them before you move on to the next thing. Okay, there are a total of 8. You can do all of them if you want. I would recommend all 8, but I want you to do at least 4. I will be looking for that. And then once you complete 4 of them, then you can move on to your homework, which is Math Excel. I am going to post the answers to all of the problems on the worksheet as well so that you have that to study from as well. All right, hope you have a good day.